Welcome to Cuba Communist Threat, the Victims of Communist Memorial Foundation series dedicated to help Americans better understand the nature of the Cuba regime, how the Cuba communist regime has been penetrating into the Latin American and Caribbean governments, how it has been a negative influence for the last 60 years in different governments in the region, and also with the Cuba exploitation with the missions, Cuban medical missions around the world. It's part of human trafficking, and how this influence from Cuba has been negative, not only in Latin America, also in other countries. We will also discuss in this series of programs the influence of Cuba in Venezuela or in Nicaragua, and how the Cuba influence has been destroying or helping to destroy democracy in those countries, and maintaining a high toll of Cuban military intervention in those countries. We will also discuss in this series the situation in Cuba, the healthcare service in Cuba, how the fake information from the Cuban regime, the disinformation, how the Cuban regime manipulate the information that was going on in Cuba, human rights violations. We will have different guest speakers, experts, who will share with us all the views at how the Cuban regime has been operating in Cuba, in Latin America, and in other countries, Italy, South Africa, and the influence from Cuba in other countries. With us today, I'm really honored. I'm Carlos Ponce. I'm the director for Latin American programs at VOC. But with us, we have, I'm honored to have Carrie Filipetti with us. She accepted to be the first one who take the challenge of participating in this series of events. Carrie is the senior. She's she's right now the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State at the Department of State. She's in charge of Cuba and Venezuela. She also worked as senior policy advisor at the U.S. mission at the UN, and the good times at the UN when Nikki Haley was talking openly about this regime and how the Cuba and Nicaragua, Venezuela, Iran doing the work exposing this regime at the UN level. She worked in Middle East, Western Hemisphere, counterterrorism. She also worked with the Paul Singer Foundation, and she changed this foundations, this nonprofit, and gave them a sense of strategic philanthropy and improve the mission. And she worked with different nonprofit, contribute with the community, and she has been a leading voice in terms of the Cuba regime and how Cuba has been advancing these programs in the region. And she will talk today about the Cuban misinformation, how Cuba used the networks, and how Cuba used the experience manipulating the news in Cuba's favor to maintain that terrible regime that has been taking too many lives and violating fundamental human rights. Carrie, it's an honor for us to have you here. It's an honor for us to have you, and we have more than 200 participants today. And please share with us your views about the Cuba regime and the misinformation, disinformation from the Cuba regime.
Great, thank you so much, Carlos. It is I who's honored to be inaugurating this series with you all. You know, I'm always really happy to participate with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. I think the mission that you all serve is incredibly important and something that we all need to be especially mindful of in these days. As you said, I want to really focus in, as we talk about the Cuban threat in Latin America, I think it's important to focus in on one key concept, which is the idea of disinformation. You know, Carlos, you just said you know, we're looking at how, in the series is looking at how Cuba is really penetrating not just Latin America but the world with its human rights abuses, with its support for terrorism, with its ideology. And one of the best ways that it does that is really through this misinformation, through the attempt at hiding the truth. You know, when we talk about victims of communism, we're talking not just about those who have been murdered by communist regimes. We're talking not just about those who have seen their family members harassed, abused, or detained, not just about those whose childhoods have been stripped away. What we're really talking about is another critical victim, which is the truth. One of the biggest threats, actually, that we see that communist regimes pose is this disinformation, because disinformation victimizes people by reducing their access to different viewpoints, by compromising their conceptions of the truth. In some cases, it manipulates well-intentioned but often disgruntled individuals into supporting dangerous ideology, and it essentially brainwashes them into compliance. And this is because communist regimes, as opposed to democracies, have a monopoly on information in their territory. They define truth. They control the press and all mechanisms to spread that truth. And they harass and intimidate and oftentimes even kill those who share facts contrary to their worldview or their ideology. And I think now is as appropriate a moment to be talking about this as any point in history, because when it comes to COVID-19, we see that the threat posed by the virus is perhaps equaled only by the threat posed by disinformation about the virus. We see a complete lack of transparency in providing critical healthcare information, including infection rates, successful treatments, and more. We've seen that largely supported by communist and socialist regimes like China, Cuba, and Venezuela. In Venezuela, for example, we've seen doctors and journalists imprisoned for sharing accurate and up-to-date information about the spread of COVID-19 in the country. And just last night, Diosdado Cabello threatened the Venezuelan Academy of Sciences merely for releasing a study on the potential effects of COVID-19 on Venezuelans. And this all matters because what COVID-19 shows us more than ever is that we cannot tolerate this disinformation in even one country, because ultimately what affects one of us affects all of us. So the world needs transparency, and that's why it's so important that the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and all of the viewers are paying attention to this issue of Cuba's disinformation around the world. So, you know, why do I mention this? Well, there's obviously many aspects to Cuba's threat to democracy and human rights. We can talk about suppression of free speech. We can talk about violations of fundamental freedoms. We can talk about the imprisonment of human rights activists and independent journalists. We can talk about corruption and economic mismanagement. But much of this ultimately all goes back to the theme of disinformation. And disinformation is a threat that affects every individual Cuban's life and livelihood. So Cuban disinformation can obviously also be taken in a million different directions. So I think what's most useful is if we focus on two main areas. The first is Cuba's disinformation regarding its role in Venezuela, which is something that I deal with on a daily basis in my current role, where I cover both Cuba and Venezuela for the Department of State. And second, Cuba's disinformation regarding the COVID-19 response. And the reason I've chosen these two cases is because in both of them, the disinformation cuts across dozens of borders and directly threatens not just the people of Cuba, but people around the world. So first on Venezuela, what the Cuban regime says is that it supports sovereignty. But the Cuban regime has always sought to subjugate its partners and turn them into propagandists for its revolution. And why? Well, the Castro regime knows that it requires economic resources to fund the repressive security apparatus that sustains its grip on power. So to get those resources, it turns to other nations, first to the Soviet Union, and then, of course, after the Soviet Union fell, to Venezuela. But it goes much further than just that the Cubans support the Venezuelan regime. It's really a parasitic relationship between the Cuban regime and the Maduro regime, so much so that it makes them virtually indistinguishable. In fact, according to eyewitness reports, Cuba's ambassador to Venezuela directly organizes and oversees Maduro's counterintelligence units, which, as we know, are the same units that are responsible for torture and repression in Venezuela. No abuse is committed in Venezuela without the Cuban ambassador's knowledge. And that's not surprising. Maduro himself actually recently stated that the Cuban ambassador is practically a member of the Venezuelan Council of Ministers. He said that there are 25,000 Cubans working in Venezuela, and that over the past 20 years, Cuba and Venezuela have signed more than 1,400 agreements. So truth be told, Nicolas Maduro is a de facto agent of the Castro regime. And in fact, I would go so far as to say he has built up the entire Cuban regime on the backs of the Venezuelan people. And it goes deeper than Maduro. So we know that in 2008, Hugo Chavez signed a secret agreement inviting Cuban personnel to infiltrate the Venezuelan military, essentially enabling them to spy and report on anybody who was disloyal. And in return for these security contracts, the Castro regime received millions of barrels of Venezuelan oil. And of course, the security arrangement continued after Castro and in fact was expanded under the Maduro regime. We know that with Cuban training and assistance, agents of the Venezuelan military counterintelligence, which is known as the DIHISIM, tap phone lines and keep dossiers on dissenters. Venezuelan soldiers who oppose Maduro, even high-ranking officials, have been disappeared by the Venezuelan regime, thanks to Cuban surveillance. And many have been incarcerated without due process and tortured. Respected human rights organizations have released detailed reports outlining the extent of Cuba's involvement in torture and other atrocities in Venezuela. So this isn't something that just the United States is accusing them of. This is international organizations as well. The Castle Institute forwarded the testimony of 83 Venezuelan torture victims to the ICC, and the testimonies show the cruelty and extent of the Castro regime's torture techniques: beatings, asphyxiation, electric shock, forced use of drugs, just to name a few. But to go back to the theme of disinformation, if you ask the Cuban regime, they say that those 25,000 individuals are doctors and teachers. They say that they respect sovereignty. And perhaps they mean the sovereignty of Cuba alone. They certainly don't mean the sovereignty of Venezuela. And we see that across the board with all of their international diplomatic engagements. And so I could focus on Cuban disinformation in the context of Venezuela for the rest of our hour, but I also want to talk about something that's affecting our daily lives, which is COVID-19. I know all of us would prefer to be having this discussion in person, where we can see each other and greet each other, and really hear the various viewpoints that I know are present in this forum. But unfortunately, we are all stuck on telework and stuck at least 6 feet away from each other because of COVID-19. And what that has really shown us and shown me is the importance of transparency. We all need accurate information, as I said, on infection rates. We need accurate information on complications and vulnerable populations. We need data on effective mitigation strategies, treatment, potential vaccine responses, and we need to understand hospital capabilities and availability of PPE. Because having these details isn't just a matter of knowing, it actually can help us effectively ensure that each of our countries can adequately prepare our medical systems and our populations and adequately plan for whatever the next phase of this virus may be. It's also important because it could help us identify new treatments, should there be success in a country in identifying something that has a positive response. But as is the theme of this discussion, transparency is particularly lacking in the Cuban system. It's clear that it's more important for the Cuban regime to advance its public image than it is for them to save Cuban lives. So here are the basic facts. Cuba first denied COVID-19 was a problem in Cuba in an effort to increase tourism to the island. They then spread false information and unproven and unresearched treatments in order to profit off of the fear and good intentions of other countries. And then finally, they committed significant human rights abuses against the global community's most precious resource, which are doctors and medical workers. So on the effort to increase tourism, the Cuban regime only acknowledged the threat COVID-19 posed on March 20th of this year. In the weeks leading up to this announcement, the regime had publicly stated that the virus could not survive in Cuba's hot climate, and in fact encouraged tourism to the island, which was already suffering known shortages of water, gasoline, and PPE. This action knowingly compromised the lives of millions of Cubans as well as foreign tourists. The Cuban regime also continues to market interferon as a treatment for COVID-19 without showing the world any proven scientific evidence. Cuba's state newspaper, Granma, I know we're all familiar with it, claimed that interferon alpha 2B was used in China as a, quote, cure, despite the lack of any proof that it was effective. And Cuba is using these claims to market interferon to other countries so that it can receive income from marketing this drug. But perhaps no Cuban disinformation on COVID-19 is as horrific as what we've seen in the Cuban Medical Missions Program, which is something that the United States has been very, very vocal about. This is another tool that the Castro regime uses to extend its global influence. The Cuban regime has taken advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic to broaden its exploitation of Cuban medical workers while trumpeting these medical missions as humanitarian aid. But what is humanitarian about passport confiscation, often against the domestic laws of the host country? And what is humanitarian about withholding payment, often providing only 10% of the doctor's salary while remaining 90% is held for the Cuban regime? And what is humanitarian about sending doctors abroad to countries that they never authorized being sent to? What's humanitarian about retaliating against doctors' families when those doctors cry out against these abuses? And this is only the question of what's humanitarian when you're looking at the perspective of the doctors. One must also ask how these doctors are helping when many of them lack the proper qualifications and training, are vastly overworked, and are often asked by the regime to withhold treatment based on the political views of the patient. That's not humanitarian. That's manipulation, and that's a human rights abuse. And even still, tens of thousands of Cubans are sent to work in approximately 60 countries. And this has only increased over the last few weeks as the Cubans have realized the opportunity to capitalize off of the fear and desperation of our partner nations, many of whom are struggling to keep up with the very urgent healthcare needs of their populations. So we've seen them target the Italians, the South Africans, Barbados, Jamaica, Mexico, Qatar, and others. These countries think that they are supporting an internal COVID-19 response. But because of the Cuban regime's manipulation, the only thing they're supporting are the wallets of the Cuban regime and the perpetuation of human trafficking around the world. In most cases, the Cuban workers, as I said, receive only a small fraction of the salary that they're guaranteed to. Typically, the Cuban regime takes 75% to 90% of the Cuban workers' salary. In fact, they take so much that these international medical missions are the #1 source of income for the Castro regime. Victims of this program are often threatened and bullied, so they feel compelled to work under substandard conditions without their passports. We've heard reports that they are surveilled by minders, and there are threats of retaliation, as I mentioned, against those of their family members that continue to live in Cuba. And they're forbidden from returning to Cuba for 8 years. As I've mentioned, this disinformation doesn't just impact the doctors themselves, it also impacts the host countries. Former participants in Cuba's medical programs in Venezuela describe how they were directed to campaign door to door in support of specific political candidates and to threaten a cessation of medical treatments if their patients did not vote as the regime wanted them to. Additionally, we're seeing some host countries identify that many of these doctors are poorly qualified, and some of them were not even doctors at all. Instead, some of these are in fact Cuban security and intelligence agents who pose as doctors while spying and collecting information on behalf of the regime. Again, a part of their disinformation campaign. In November of 2019, as I think many of us know, Bolivian authorities discovered several Cuban medical staff participating in large-scale political protesters. And according to the Bolivians, the Cuban staff were carrying backpacks full of cash, money they were using to pay Bolivian protesters to undermine Bolivia's own electoral process. Again, how can this be considered humanitarian? So these disturbing facts are among the reasons that Bolivia and Ecuador recently ended their Cuban medical programs. We have been encouraging many countries to take a good look at the existing programs, and particularly a good look at the programs that have been implemented in light of COVID-19. We recognize the desire to bring doctors in. We recognize that many of these countries do not have the native capacity to treat as many people as we're seeing become hospitalized because of COVID-19. We are not asking countries to stop accepting doctors from Cuba. What we are asking is that they ensure that these programs protect one of the world's most precious resources, which is our medical workers. We are merely asking that these countries pay those doctors directly rather than paying the Cuban regime. But of course, these countries know what we all know, which is that the Cuban regime will not allow these programs to continue if doctors are paid directly, because the Cuban regime does not care about the humanitarian aspect of the program. They merely want to profit off of the panic and fear caused by COVID-19. So it's a quick summary of the two kind of largest instances of Cuban disinformation that we're seeing, and it leads to the question of what can we do? First, we need to always defend the truth and call out these abuses and manipulation for what they are. We have to recognize that this is not a regime that shares the same values as the rest of the world. And if we truly support openness, human rights, and freedoms, we need to work together to demand that the regime stops hiding the truth. Second, we cannot allow these manipulations to distract us from our true purpose. This is exactly why they're out there. They hope to bog us down with disinformation, forcing us to respond, investigate, and otherwise delay all of our other positive, proactive policies that would successfully bring freedom to Cuba. And so we cannot allow that to happen. We will continue our policy towards Cuba, which is to seek a return to democracy and free enterprise. And I think many on this call are familiar with the different mechanisms that the United States has used in order to try to hold the Cuban regime responsible for its abuses of power. There is good news, though, which is that we are seeing many more countries come out on the side of truth. This is the first time that countries in Latin America, Chile, Ecuador, Brazil, Colombia, El Salvador, Bolivia, are asking how they can work with us in order to combat this disinformation. They recognize that this disinformation being perpetuated by the regime needs to stop, and they recognize that they, much like the Cuban people, are victims of it. They're taking action to protect their borders and their citizens and their sovereignty. And they aren't the only ones. I mean, even the EU, through its parliamentarians, have spoken about the Cuban regime's abuses of human rights and have called into question the utility of the EU's human rights and political dialogues with the regime, a dialogue that has to date not provided any significant improvement in the human rights situation for Cubans on the island. So I think it's clear that countries realize that our policy for Cuba stems from a genuine desire to support the Cuban and Venezuelan people who are suffering under tyranny. And this is something that we can all agree on. So before we get to questions, and I realize that I've gone well over time, I hope it was useful. I just say that if the Cuban regime wants international legitimacy, it must earn that legitimacy by adhering to the standards of decent societies. And that starts with the truth. And the international community needs to insist on this. We can't ever prioritize commercial opportunities over moral values. And we must demand the regime stop harassing and detaining peaceful activists and independent journalists. We must demand they release political prisoners and that they provide for a democratic and prosperous future for the Cuban people. Because while the regime tries to silence its own people by preventing them from accessing the truth, they can't silence the entire world. So this really should be the easiest policy in the world to support. It's merely the promotion of truth. And we hope that others will continue to join us. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to this forum. I very much look forward to any questions that there are.
Well, Carrie, this has been extraordinary, a wide-ranging wide-ranging presentation, different topics. You cover the disinformation, you cover the medical missions and the lack of legitimacy of this mission, how they have been hiding the truth, and how the truth has been facing also a major violation in Cuba, because Cubans doesn't know what's going on in Cuba, and people doesn't know what is going on in Cuba or what's going on in their own countries with the Cuban influence. So for anyone who just joined us or who has been watching this program, you can send your questions via the Q&A function, and we will try to bring all those questions to Carrie for her to answer all these questions. The first thing that I want to ask you, Carrie, it's about the role of the U.S. government in terms of exposing this misinformation, exposing the impact of the Cuban communists in the region, how this country of Latin America and other are in danger of expanding the Cuban communists, and how the Cuban regime has been using all this structure that they have, the G2 and all the influence in the region and the international community. This question has two parts. One is how is this influencing the rest of Latin America and other countries? And I know as a fact that USA, the Department of State has been really active, the administration has been really active to expose the regime. Your work is the first time that you have the Cuba and Venezuela in the same desk and thinking about that impact. John Barrs at USA, all the effort from USA promoting, supporting, exposing the regime, Carlos Trujillo, Michael, there are several persons that really care about Cuba right now, and you, of course. So those two questions in one. Cuba, communists, how we can stop that, what is the impact, and the role from the US government in terms of stopping the threat.
Sure. Well, it's a great question, and you know, you mentioned that I occupy a position that is quite new. You know, typically the Deputy Assistant Secretary who covers Venezuela does not also cover Cuba, but what this administration realized is, let's boil it down to core principles. And at the end of the day, the threat that Cuba poses is the same that the threat Venezuela poses. You know, the Cuban intervention in Venezuela is why Venezuela is in the position that it's in today. And so, as I said, it's not just that one supports the other. You know, we're talking about two indistinguishable regimes. And it's important that we realize that, because that will fundamentally affect our policies going forward. I'm really grateful that this administration recognized that and has continued to ensure that our policies on Cuba and Venezuela have been perfectly aligned. And as you said, you know, we have just some absolutely fantastic individuals who are working in USAID, at the State Department. Ambassador Trujillo has done a remarkable job of highlighting Cuba's role in the OAS, and of course, I had the distinct opportunity and pleasure to work for Ambassador Haley when she was at the UN, and of course raised the issue of the Cuban threat multiple times during her time there, even though the UN is typically not a forum in which Latin American issues are discussed. She changed that precedent to make sure that the threats to international peace and security that are posed by the Cuban, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan regimes are fully addressed in that forum. You know, in terms of how to combat this threat, you know, I would say that there's two key things that we're doing. The first is making sure that the truth is getting, actually both of them are connected to the idea of making sure that the truth is getting out there. You know, as I said, disinformation is the core of these challenges. And what that means is we need to make sure that these independent voices that are in Cuba are able to share their message with the world. We've been doing that in a number of different ways. First, we try to make sure that we're promoting what's going on in Cuba and the truth of what's going on in Cuba as much as possible. Our mission, our embassy in Havana, is very focused on making sure that we're promoting human rights, that we are meeting with human rights defenders, that we are ourselves calling out abuses as we see them, so that the Cuban regime can't continue to hide behind the information that it alone is putting out. We also try to amplify the voices of Cuban artists and journalists who are trying to report on this, and oftentimes putting themselves in harm's way by sharing this information. And their courage inspires us on a daily basis, and continuing to promote those voices, both through our social media accounts, but as well as making sure they have access to multilateral fora is a way for us to do that. You know, obviously disinformation goes back to silencing these individuals. And so our best tactic is to make sure that those voices are not silenced, but that they get amplified. And so we've also been using international fora for this. As I mentioned, we've brought this numerous times to the OAS and to the UN. I think both of those venues have proven successful in highlighting that there are serious concerns about human rights abuses and disinformation being spread by the Cuban regime. And we will continue to hold those kinds of events. Lastly, I would just say, it's important for us to expose this disinformation in our private diplomatic engagements. And I can say that a huge part of what I do on a regular basis is making sure that we're speaking to other countries and speaking to other partners and highlighting exactly what it is that we're seeing and challenging them to look into the facts as well, because many of them don't necessarily have the same access to information that we have. They don't necessarily know the full details of what's going on in Cuba, because in order to retain their presence on the island, they need to toe the party line. And so we help provide some more information and detail so that they can be vocal too. We've seen that successfully work in some cases. I mean, I think the fact that the EU came out in support of José Daniel Ferrer and messaged about him, and the fact that his continued imprisonment was a violation of his human rights. I think this is partially why he was released to house arrest. Of course, he shouldn't be under any kind of arrest, but I do think that it's important that we help get our partners to a position where they understand what's going on, because their voice is taken seriously, by the Cubans, and hopefully they can do a great job of holding the Cubans responsible for actually sharing the truth.
Oh, that's excellent. It's exposing, and I think that is a key role of the U.S. government, exposing the Cuban regime. And we have a specific question about exposing, about the role of the U.S. at the UN. We know that the UN has been controlled by Cuba, by China, and now it's more clear how those countries have been manipulating the UN, and specifically the UN Human Rights Council, how they have manipulated and have been including the worst countries to talk about and to protect human rights. So how do you see the role of sanctions, the role of diplomacy, the role of the UN, the OAS, the international arena? How you see the role in to expose Castro regimes and now the Diaz-Canel regime, responsibilities for torture, arrests, crimes against humanity in Cuba?
This is, Carlos, that's a really important question, because that goes to kind of the theme of disinformation. And speaking for myself, one of the biggest fears that I have is when I see regimes try to manipulate well-intentioned individuals, desperate individuals, and in so doing, they end up hijacking these critically important principles. Here, a perfect example. Cuba believes that its Cuban Doctors Program is beyond reproach because it does the program under the guise of humanitarian aid. And of course, nobody would criticize humanitarian aid. And so they know that if they operate under the guise of human rights, humanitarian aid, and so on, then people won't really question it. And that's what we need to do. We need to get countries to question it. We need to get countries to question whether or not funding that goes directly to the Castro regime will actually get to the people of Cuba. And the answer is it won't. If anything, the Cuban regime is profiting off of the backs of the Cuban people, as we see very clearly with the Cuban Doctors Program. So, you asked about our sanctions, and that's exactly what it's there to do. It is there to recognize that absolutely we need humanitarian assistance, we need food support, agricultural support to be making it to countries where we have a significant sanctions program, whether that's Iran or whether that's Venezuela or whether that's Cuba. But what we need to make sure is that that assistance is not politicized. It is a priority of the United States, as it is a priority of the United Nations, that humanitarian assistance be apolitical and be delivered only based off of need. Well, the Cuban regime won't do that, and the Venezuelan regime won't do that. And so any money that goes to them for them to procure assistance is not actually going to be used to procure assistance. I mean, we've seen that used in the CLAP program in Venezuela, $300 million in contracts going to pro-regime officials. Where was that going to, the Venezuelan people? It wasn't. And so I think it's really important that we not allow these programs to be manipulated, and that we have that instinct of questioning whether or not this is something that will actually help the Cuban people. And so This is why our sanctions are specifically targeting sources where the Cuban regime is disproportionately benefiting. This is why we have focused our Cuba restricted list on those entities that are associated with the Venezuelan military, intelligence, and security forces, which are those same entities that are oppressing the Cuban people and, in fact, the Venezuelan people. So I think we have to take a really nuanced approach to it. We can't just do a full ban of all humanitarian assistance, but we need to make sure that the regime does not have access to these finances that it would use to further repress the people. And that's where our sanctions policy really comes in.
And it has been, in my own experience, it has been very effective in the last 2 years. The campaign from the U.S. government and talking with the different governments with respect to the Cuban doctors, the fake medical missions and how they have been manipulating, using human trafficking, and all of this just for profit. All of this just for using the money to maintain an ineffective and corrupt regime that violates human rights. The Cuban regime, because of the exposure, has been saying that they reinvest, that they pay only 10% of the money to the doctors from the $10,000 that they charge in Chad, in other countries, or $5,000, they only pay the Cuban doctor $900. And the rest, they reuse that money, reinvest for the Cuban people to have access to a better healthcare system in Cuba. So we have a question precisely about the Cuban health doctors and how that underestimate in those countries the willingness to improve the medical education and the medical system, how this is more ideological than really helping this country, and how also this healthcare program, international missions that's supposed to be humanitarian, also is a major lie to maintain the corruption internally in Cuba, and it's not benefited the people in Cuba. Can you share with us your view about that?
Sure. I mean, the medical mission program has been something that we've been focused on over the last year or so, because people, when we started this process, we spoke to countries that had accepted Cuban doctors, and many of them said, listen, we hear you, we see that that maybe there is that there are things that the Cuban regime is doing that are inappropriate, but these doctors are really helpful, they're really useful, they're really helping our population. And I mean, of course, right? That isn't that what trafficking is? It's recognizing that there's a need, that there's a service that can be provided that people want but don't want to pay for. And so then you put people into the condition of being trafficked or enslaved in order to provide that service. I mean, this is no different from the trafficking that we're seeing, the human trafficking that we're seeing across the world, whether it's sex trafficking, I mean, or whatever it is. All of these traffickings serve a need. But it oppresses the people who are being forced to participate. And as I said, when it comes to coronavirus and everything that we're learning, these medical workers are our largest resource. We need to protect them. We need to make sure that they have access to the appropriate PPE. We need to make sure that they are receiving income for putting themselves and their lives on the line on a daily basis. Instead, the regime is stealing all of that money. Instead, the regime is only engaging in contracts where they are receiving the income. And I think one of the things that is most devastating to me is seeing how some of these doctors had the courage to come out. Oftentimes, one story of an individual who had to run through the Amazonian forest essentially for 9 hours until she reached some sort of safe haven. And these individuals, what happens to their families in Cuba is that their family members lose their jobs. Their family members get harassed or intimidated. So it's a never-ending cycle of oppression inside Cuba. And this is all because the Cubans want to profit, the Cuban regime wants to profit off of their backs. And, what I'm frustrated by is that the Cuban regime looks at coronavirus not as this devastating virus that could potentially kill millions of people. It's looking at it as an opportunity for them to boost their own income. And I find that disgusting. And I think we all need to find that disgusting. And I do think the international community needs to come up with a way to address the serious concerns that countries have that don't have the capacity in their own country to handle the healthcare situation that they're faced with. I absolutely agree with that. And I think if we collectively work together on a solution to make sure that countries that need doctors have them, I think that's critically important. But we can't traffic those doctors. We can't just turn a blind eye to the abuses that they're experiencing and that their families are experiencing.
I have a different question here. How about the role of the youth, the young Cuban, the young leaders that wants to fight to restore democracy in Cuba, to achieve democracy in Cuba? What do you have to say for them? What's their role? How we can help them to fight against this terrible regime?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we try to focus on a daily basis, because if you look at our NSPM-5, which is the articulation of the Trump administration strategy on Cuba, we have two separate portions. The first one is to hold the Cuban regime responsible for abuses of human rights and violations of fundamental freedom by denying them the financial income that they use to power that repression. And that's something that we've been in the news for doing multiple times, what with our tourism reforms, the invocation of Title III of the Libertad Act, and of course our multiple sanctions regimes on Cuba. But the other, which is just as important, if not more important, is continuing to support the human rights of people on the island. So a few different things that we're doing on that. So first and foremost, making sure that we are amplifying those voices. Unfortunately, as you know, oftentimes, if we amplify those voices, these individuals receive retaliation. And that's something we need to be really mindful of. This regime does not tolerate people coming to the United States, going to Europe, and sharing concerns that go against what the Cuban regime believes is, revolutionary ideology. We're seeing how Decree 370 is being used to penalize people for sharing information about COVID-19. Again, just another mechanism to reduce freedom of speech. So to those who are fighting for this on the island, I would just say that their courage is remarkable. We will continue to support them. We will continue to provide resources to them where we can, provide amplification to their messages, and fight for them, not just in our engagements with the Cuban regime, but of course in our engagements with our international partners as well. They are critically important. The Cuban regime wants all of the dissidents to just leave the island, to leave them alone, let them run their communist haven in Cuba, and all the dissidents can leave. These are people who are fighting for their country. They're true patriots. The foundation of patriotism is dissent. You think about the United States and our own history of fighting for freedom. Where it stemmed from was disagreement, dissent, well articulated against our leadership at the time, and that is the root and foundation of all democracy. And it's important that we not allow the Cuban regime to disabuse us of the notion that dissent will finally get us where we need to be. I mean, this is how other countries have been successful, and will continue to support the Cuban people in their struggle for freedom as well. It's very similar to our own, and we want to make sure that they have the opportunity to live in freedom once again.
Yeah. There's a courage behind each one of these human rights fighters in Cuba. Ferrer, when they sent Ferrer to his house arrest, he told to the police and to the members of the regime in the prison that they will see him soon, that he will be back, because he will continue working against the regime. So it's just temporary. So that's the kind of approach that they have. We have a different question that goes in line with the exposing the regime, the misinformation. Is do you think enough has been done to counter misinformation and disinformation coming from the Cuban regime and or from other regimes supporting the Cuban government? If not, what do you think the U.S. should be doing to counter misinformation in Cuba, and the role of the independent press to counter misinformation in Cuba? Is the role, and also let's include another question that I have here, is for those supposedly journalists and other media that has been supporting the regime after 60 years, they're still supporting the regime in Cuba and the regime in Venezuela. So those questions are connected.
Yeah, those are really good questions. Are we doing enough? No. I mean, the Cuban regime focuses exclusively on disinformation. You know, that is what they spend 100% of their time on. We are focused on combating that disinformation, but we are also focused on hundreds of thousands, millions of other policy priorities at the same time, both with respect to Cuba and Venezuela, but also writ large. So we're not doing enough. I think there's a lot more that can be done, but I think a lot of it needs to also be done by other partners. So first and foremost, let's go, for example, to the PDC, the human rights dialogue between the EU and the Cuban regime. The United States was a part of a human rights dialogue as well back in 2016. We did find that following this engagement in the dialogue, there were actually more instances of human rights abuses perpetuated by the regime than in the previous year when we weren't involved in the dialogue. And we see this across the board because Cubans know very well that well-intentioned Americans, well-intentioned Europeans want to see dialogue as a means to an end, that if we keep talking, then maybe eventually we'll get to a solution. But we need to make sure that we are actually leading towards a solution and they're not just taking our hand and walking us down an empty path. And we realized that we stopped our cooperation. I think that there is a legitimate space for there to be a conversation about human rights, but I think that space needs to be generated first and foremost by the Cuban regime doing something to improve the human rights situation on the island. So this goes back to my point. We cannot allow these principles and our, good intentions to be hijacked by the Cuban regime. We must say that when we're in a human rights dialogue with you, we want to see results. We're not just here to have the conversation. And I think it's really important that other countries realize that when we were involved in this dialogue, when the US was involved in this dialogue, we were having conversations with dissidents and with civil rights defenders that the regime told us we shouldn't be having conversations with. And I think many other countries are worried that if they have those conversations, the Cubans will kick them out of the country. We can't give the Cuban regime that much power. Do we really think that if every country in Europe says we need to meet with these human rights defenders, that the Cuban regime will say no and compromise its international legitimacy? The EU and others have much more power that they can exert than I think they currently are exerting. And we know that we share the same principles. We know that we share the same goals as the EU. We do have different tactics, and I do think that they could be forward-leaning and using the strength and the power that they have as the European Union to successfully push for some of their very important goals. I also think the same could be said for the UN. The UN has a very particular mandate of making sure that human rights and humanitarian assistance do not get politicized and do not get hijacked by bad actors. And unfortunately, as we've seen in the Human Rights Council, in some cases, they've lost that battle. The fact that Cuba has been on the Human Rights Council, the fact that Venezuela was recently elected to the Human Rights Council is absurd. And it should be incredibly distressing to the entire UN system. It should be incredibly distressing to the entire global community that these human rights violators are being given this platform. It is clear that human rights violators want to be a part of the Human Rights Council so that they can ensure that no action is taken against them for their significant abuses of power. And the UN needs to realize that its goal should not just be, everything's okay, because at some point, everything's not okay. And they need to have the moral courage to stand up for that and say that. And I think there's a lot more that they can be doing. Many of their special rapporteurs have been calling out these abuses, which I think is remarkable and incredibly courageous. And we want to make it clear that we stand with them when they do make those statements, because they're incredibly important. The UN must be an unbiased resource for those who support peace and human rights and freedoms in the world. The last piece I would say is when it comes to independent journalists. Here I would say it's important for journalists to recognize that there are consequences to their blindly believing some of these, statements coming from the Cuban regime, coming from the Venezuelan regime. I find a lot of my time is trying to explain to people that, well, actually what the Cuban regime said, isn't true, it's a lie. And they'll say, well, do you have proof? Well, you can't have proof when it didn't exist in the first place, right? And so you can't prove something never happened, or you can't prove a negative. You can only prove a positive. So I would say the independent press really just needs to question why. Sorry, my phone keeps ringing. I'm turning it off now. Needs to start questioning why it is that certain things are being put forward. Sorry, I'm just going to put this on hold. So I think independent journalists need to make sure that they are really tracking down the facts, really tracking down the truth, really making sure that that they're not buying into any of these campaigns against the Cuban people, because it's not just about what, sometimes I think people try to antagonize the U.S. for, our current administration or whatever the case may be, but they have to realize that that has a consequence for the people on the island inside Cuba as well. And so that's what we want to make sure that they're aware of. I think many of our journalists have been doing a fantastic job. There's been remarkable support for what we're doing with respect to the Cuban Doctors Program. Many of the things that we've been looking into have actually first come to our attention because of journalists. So I would just say to continue on that track and continue to highlight that, the job of a journalist is to make sure that there are strong, proofs behind everything that they're putting out there.
Excellent. We have like 40 more questions here. We don't have enough time, but I assure everyone that we're gonna send all these questions to Carrie so she can be aware of all the concerns that some of you has been including in your questions. Some of your questions are direct question for her. So let's ask her the last question, and it's about the relationship between Russia, China, Cuba, and Venezuela. That's a strong link, and how this all these regimes right now are connected to each other. And since you cover both countries, Cuba and Venezuela, what do you have to say about that negative influence from China, in particular China, into Cuba and Venezuela?
Sure. When we look at Venezuela and why Venezuela is where it is, I think one of the key reasons is because of the international support that it has. Cuba, Russia, and China are three of the most significant supporters that we've seen. I think much of why Russia is involved in Venezuela is because they know that it's an annoyance to the United States. They view it as sort of retaliation for other actions that the U.S. has taken, other actions that they accuse the U.S. of having taken, and so they have decided to try to create chaos in this hemisphere. We do know, however, as we start seeing the Venezuelan regime start to develop stronger ties to the Iranian regime, we start to question the extent to which the Russians are continuing to provide the full extent of the support that they once provided. Obviously, oil prices are down significantly, which means that a large factor in why the Russians continue to be involved, which is the money that they were able to profit off of by reselling Venezuelan oil, is no longer available to them. The way I would answer that question is all four of these countries, Cuba, Russia, China, and Venezuela, are intimately connected and very strongly supporting the disinformation that we're talking about. Look at China's response to COVID-19 and the lack of transparency in what was going on in China before they ultimately exported this virus internationally. I think we all need to recognize that we can't take the word of these countries at face value. We need to dive into it. As I said, we need to get to the bottom of it, and we need to support the truth, because supporting the truth is what's going to ultimately allow us to support the people of Cuba and Venezuela as well. So, in terms of the types of support they're providing, we have seen in the past that Russia and China have been obviously involved in Venezuelan oil. We know that the Russians have also sent certain military personnel to Venezuela, and we're certain that the Chinese, much like the Cubans, are helping to provide with some surveillance and intelligence support. Again, I think each of these countries is doing it for their own purpose, and the Venezuelans are the ones who are suffering. The Cubans want to retain the Venezuelan oil pipeline that enables the Castro regime to stay in power, and so they will manipulate the Venezuelan people. The Chinese want to make sure that they're perpetuating their ideology in the hemisphere, and so they want to subjugate the Venezuelan people for that purpose as well. And the Russians want to manipulate the Venezuelans into being really this ally for Russia in the Western Hemisphere, so that they can attack and antagonize the United States. So all of these countries are manipulating Venezuela, which has a leadership that under Maduro is just completely incapable of anything, even recognizing that these countries are trying to manipulate him for their own purposes. So I would say I don't see these countries all coordinating in their intervention in Venezuela, or their intervention in Cuba for that matter. But I do see them all being very heavily involved. And of course, the United States is going to continue to hold them responsible, as we've held the Russians responsible for our designation on Rosneft trading, and have also designated a handful of other companies from these foreign countries that continue to be involved in busting.
Excellent. I really enjoyed this discussion. We had too many topics, and you covered perfectly all of those topics, and gave us really good information about the role of the regime, the Cuban regime, in the rest of the region, and how the misinformation or disinformation has been having a major impact in Cuba and outside Cuba. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your participation. I just want to tell you for VOC, for Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, has been an honor to have you in our first program of this series. I want to invite all the participants to join us next week in same days, same time, to continue discussions about the Cuba regime and the communist threat that the Cuba regime has been imposing in the rest of the world. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you very much, Carrie, and please keep the hard work, and let's continue exposing this terrible regime, or both regimes, the Maduro regime and the Cuba Diaz-Canel regime. And someday we're going to have a major success bringing democracy in those countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.